Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about the 3 magic depth zones that are going to produce the majority of the bites that you get. These are the 3 depths that the fish generally feed at. And if you recognize these 3 depths, you can really hone in the exact locations that you're going to be fishing. It'll help you generate more bites and produce a much more productive day on the water. Now, before I get into these 3 magic depth zones, I do want to remind you I've got a members only page. So if you're looking for more content from me, please check out my members only page. You can go to the YouTube homepage, click the join button, find out everything you need to know about the members only page. Also, if you're looking to support the channel and you need to purchase a little bit of tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. Every little bit that I make from that comes right back into making content for you guys. Okay. So let's talk about the 3 depth zones. What I mean by these 3 depth zones is these are going to be the 3 key depths where the majority of the bass are going to feed. Now, these depth zones, 2 of them don't ever change. 1 of them does potentially change. So what I mean by that is the 2 that don't change is going to be the bottom of the lake as well as the surface of the lake. So when you're talking about both the bottom and the surface, you've got 2 key areas that allow the fish to pin their forage species against either the surface or the bottom. Therefore, they can limit where their forage can get, and therefore it makes it easier for them to feed. So if you've got fish that are feeding on shad, a lot of times they push them to the surface so that they can pin them against the surface. That way, when the shad is trying to get away from the bass, they can't keep going higher up in the water because they hit the surface. So once they hit the surface, they go left, right, they can only go one direction at that point, really. So the bass pin them against the surface. The same thing can be said for fishing on the bottom. If you've got bass that are pushing deep bait, they'll push them right into the actual bottom contour lines. A lot of times these are going to be your ledges because that ledge forms a wall. So when they push the bait into that wall, the bait hits the wall. They can only go a couple of directions. It limits the movement of the bait fish, making them easier to capture for the bass. So that's something really key to point out. Now, your surface does not change, right? That's always the top of the water. The bottom depth does tend to change based on how deep the bait are and how much light penetration gets into the water column. So if you're fishing really muddy water, generally that strengthens the depth that the bass are going to get. If you're in very, very muddy water, you're generally going to be fishing in 10, 12 feet of water or less. If you're in very clear water, that means you could have bass that are down to 50 feet of water depending on the time of year. So, you just want to make sure your bait is keying in on the bottom, right? So if you're fishing the top of the water column, you're talking about your surface baits, you're talking about weightless baits that are going to be right under the surface. If you're talking about the bottom, you're talking about fishing a bottom bouncing bait, whether that's a blade bait or a heavy jig to get you down 30 feet, or maybe you're just dragging a Carolina rig in 15 feet of water. The point is you want to be making bottom contact. So that means there's one other magic depth zone, and this is one that does not get talked about that much, but based on my experience, it can be one of the best depth zones that the bass tend to feed at quite frequently. And that's the depth at which your light disperses. So what I mean by that is if you've got, say, a floating worm, a bright colored bait, and you throw it out and you twitch it 2 feet under the surface and you still can see it very well, that's not the correct depth. You want to let that bait get to the point where it disappears just out of your view. So like for me, if I'm fishing on the Wisconsin River here, that's probably only 1.5 feet down. If I'm fishing a place like Dale Hollow, where I was earlier this year, it was probably more like 5 feet down. The point is, once you get light that disperses at a certain depth, it almost creates an ambush location for the bass. Meaning, if it's higher up in the water column, it's easier for the bait. If that's, say it's a shad, it's easier for the shad to see the bass coming for them. It makes it easier for them to get away. If the shad are sitting right at a level where there isn't much more light penetration below that depth, Now the bass can get closer without that shad knowing that they're there. And in my experience, this works very, very well. So the key is to figure out what bait will run about at that depth. So, you can be just above it, you can be just below it, but you want to try to keep your bait at that level where sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. And it's just because that is a key feeding level, and that fluctuates a little bit based on the lake that you're in, but it's a key feeding level for bass. It could be you're in 6 feet of water and that light penetration kind of ends at 2.5 or 3 feet. So you want a bait that's going to run roughly at 3 feet. It could be in a clear body of water you can see 10, 12 feet down. You want your bait running at 10, 12 feet. Because at that point, even if the bass is on the bottom in 20 feet, they're still going to be able to creep up on that bait that's running right at that 12-foot mark. It's just, it's a consistent thing that I have learned from my experience, that is a key feeding depth right where that light tends to dissipate, where you can no longer see your bait because the light penetration doesn't make it much further into the water. But the key there is either if you're working say a plastic bait, being able to work it at that depth, or to choose another bait that runs roughly at that depth. So if you're choosing a crankbait and that light dissipates, say at 4 feet, try to grab a crankbait that runs right in that 4 or 5 foot mark. Maybe that would be a good instance where you would take a jerkbait and work a jerkbait down to that depth. But you want to make sure that your bait is running roughly at that level. If you're not fishing that level, in my opinion, you either want to be fishing the surface or you want to be fishing the bottom. And another thing that supports this, and this goes off of some of the things we see with forward-facing sonar, is a lot of times those fish are going to suspend right at that level where the light kind of dissipates. Generally, actually, they're a few feet below it. So if you've got 4 or 5 feet of light visibility, the fish a lot of times will suspend at like 6, 7, 8 feet. And that's just so that they can be close enough to know that that bait's there and still be able to ambush them without the bait fish knowing that the bass are there. So this is some of the experiences I've learned, but those are by far the 3 best, what I would call magic depth zones, where you're going to get the majority of your bites, because those are the depths that the bass are using to feed. And if you've got actively feeding bass, you're going to have a lot more bites than trying to convince non-actively feeding bass into biting. So let me know in the comments section, have you experienced similar results? And if so, please share them with us. Otherwise, guys, if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.